Very pleased to have Chetna Sinha, who's the founder and chairperson of Mandeshi Bank. Thank you, ma'am, for coming all the way. Shruti Gonzalez, who's the MD and CEO of Sitara. We have Asta Kapoor, who's the co-founder of Apti Institute, and Shweta, who's senior director at Axion International. Together, I mean, so, this video makes me think that there are obviously problems that are common across countries, because we saw India, we saw South Africa, but gender is also deeply contextual and, shaped by norms. So I'm going to actually open up with a question to all of you, which is, how do you, with your respective lens as practitioners, as researchers, as investors, how do you, address this? What does a gender intentional approach really mean in your field, or in your way of operating? Sure.
Yeah. So the sessions before, I was listening, and some things which came in my mind as far as gender intentionality is concerned. Mandeshi Bank was started for savings. And it was very much surprising that all over the country, everybody was talking microcredit, but we saw that women were saying that we want to do savings. Yeah. So here itself, thank you. There itself, actually, I do think that communities or women think differently. But I'm not talking about Mandeshi Bank, but I would like to narrate one incident which actually changed our whole approach how to work with women in banking. This was in 2010, when a woman came in our bank who was our borrower, and she said that, and then as soon as she came, our manager said that, oh, she has not repaid her installment. For four installments she has not repaid. And good, today she has come, so we will get her repayment. And she said that I've come here to tell you that I have multiple loans, my husband has ran away, but I cannot, because I have children going to school and I have to look after them. And so I have come here to say that I cannot repay further loans because I'm earning for my family alone. My husband is not here. And find some solutions. And our manager was, no, we don't want to listen to anything. You have to repay, your account is in NPA, this and that. And I felt that this lady, who is not running away because of a loan, she has come here herself into the bank saying that I want to repay but I cannot, and find the solution. And I felt like we are such a lucky bank to have this lucky client, right, in that way. And so I was telling a branch manager, you cannot deal this way. And that was the first time where we started thinking. Since 1999, Mandeshi Bank is doing financial literacy for women, thinking that they need to be educated, right? But that was the first time I thought, not women. Bankers need to be educated. Correct. Right? That is, that bankers need to be educated. This is the situation. And so that time we redesigned our financial literacy, and we said we will co-create financial literacy, and we had the component of debt counseling for first-time borrower. And I think it is so important that when you want to do financial inclusion, when you want to address something like, we are so proud about it, right? That we have given loans to so many low-income group women. But the risk they have taken, the pain they have taken to repay the loan, to give the interest to investor, is it not responsible for us to see that how much pain they are taking? And after that, when we designed this whole debt counseling as a component of financial literacy, we went to Reserve Bank of India. And we said that how would it be that all the rating agencies, CIBIL, Highmark, whatever 4 rating agencies are there, find out that how many multiple borrowing has happened, how many women have defaulted, and how can we address that? How can we bring lender as a responsible financer in that? And here I would just like to end that, it's very it's very, very important that when we are working on financial inclusion, working in the communities who are banking with us first time, who want to do saving, we do credit with the returns, high returns. It's not the low returns when they repay. Then how much responsibility in action we are showing it. So I do think that if we want to work with women, the one thing we have to make sure to convey the message, not by just saying trust or words, but by action. We are here to support you, and we are here to address your risk. If we cannot do that, I don't think that we have any right to do it. And that lady, actually, and I'm very proud to share with you that this lady, Rupali Shinde, she was in China last week addressing the BRICS Bank conference, sharing her experience that how did she design the debt counseling financial literacy. Thank you.
I love that. I love that example so much. Thank you for sharing it. Ma'am.
Yeah, sure. So, excellent. I mean, you have set the tone for the entire discussion. Before we start and before I give my comments, I would say that three of us share a same connect with SEWA, which is Self-Employed Women's Association. So I would like to start my comment by first of all paying tribute to late Ila Bhatt, who actually thought of how way back in 1970s about empowering women and therefore working with the unorganized sector, which forms practically 90% of the women's workforce in India. So having said that, the gender intentionality is, okay, you have your vision, mission statements, you strongly believe that you would want to work with women entrepreneurs or women as borrowers or women as the ones who would like to save. But at the same time, in your own organization, we need to have that kind of gender balance in the team. And when I talk about gender balance, it's not excluding men. We need to recognize that there has to be perspective coming in from both male professionals as well as women colleagues to design products and processes which are then suitable for this kind of clientele whom we want to serve. So that is one part of intentionality which needs to be thought through and which also needs to be imbibed in our actual practicing. So we at Sitara or Seva Graharin Limited, which is Seva's affordable housing finance company, that is what we strongly believe in. And I'll conclude my comment by saying that in the later discussion points, I would like to talk about the gender sensitization, which is equally important to ensure that you have that kind of workforce in place.
Yeah, I mean, in my head, I'm almost setting up this framework where, we start off with the end user, get into, shaping the culture of the organization. I want to turn to you as an investor or bringing the investor perspective, Shweta, both, at the time of investment as well as, after, as you're helping an investee company transform. What are things that you might have to keep in mind and, challenges that you might have experienced?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jayashree. So as Michael had first said, Axion has investments and has its funds and invests in early stage fintech companies and then growth stage microfinance and financial service providers. But our funds have a gender lens investment strategy. And that includes ensuring that women founders enter and progress through our investment process. We enable our portfolio companies to have an inclusive and diverse workplace, connect these kind of women founders to the resources and capital they need, and finally also bring that investment community together to share our experiences as well as ultimately drive more capital to these women founders. Gender and a gender lens being core throughout our organization and all our work. But having said that, in terms of also how we as an investor work with our investee companies, today we collect the data more at the founder level and key management positions. But I've just started beginning to look at the data from the portfolio perspective or the impact at women businesses. And the challenge there that we see is many of these investee companies, I wish we had more examples from Mandeshi Bank and Sitara, but generally we see that, the portfolio companies don't see the business opportunity or don't always have the data or the resources to be able to see that opportunity in serving women businesses. And yeah, there are certain business models which don't lend themselves easily to serving women customers. So what we do sitting on the board as well as in these kind of subcommittees is ask those questions. At least when when they're making hiring decisions or HR policies or even looking to design products, is to ask those questions and sensitize them. Like, are we looking at 50% of that population, that business potential? Because definitely the business case to serve women-led businesses is just out there. We know that it makes business sense. And to go further on, what we do as part of our advisory team is then work with our portfolio companies as well as our non-portfolio companies to really take that sex disaggregated data and that data to help them gather, analyze, and make decisions. So hopefully, while we may not be able to influence too much at the investment level, but then through our advisory, we can help support our companies. So.
Yeah, no, it makes me think about data and what is the kind of data that we should gather. So I'm going to turn to you, Asta, because, as gender can be treated as just a categorical variable, but obviously, there's much more to that because of what lies behind it. I know you've been thinking about how can you use data points, including the lived experience of the user. So what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, and I'm glad to come after Chetna, Shruti, and Shweta, because this sets me up really nicely because of a couple of things. So I think Shruti and I were maybe in the field at the same time in 2010 when Aadhaar was being rolled out for the first time. This is India's digital ID program. And then we realized that to get the
direct benefit transfer.
And direct benefit, DBTs. And so to get women to scan their iris, and as some of you might know, women in India sometimes have veils over their faces. Women were refusing to pull out their veil to get their iris scanned. We also realized later that as women do a lot of housework, sometimes getting their fingerprints for a biometric scan is hard. There are other examples most recently, which is that in the case everywhere, you go to a restaurant, you go wherever, people ask you for your phone number, which is a very different data point for a man than it is for a woman. So all of this to say is that even as we think about technology, we have to code in experiences of women and how they think about usage, how they think about their lived experiences with technology, and think about that in a much more intentional way. More specifically on data, what we are realizing, and this is maybe related to what you said, Shweta, as well, is that we need to think more critically about data about women, but also the ways in which women use data about themselves, because there's, data is a relational question. Data about me impacts the women in India and vice versa. So we've been thinking quite a lot about how do we get groups of women to steward their data more meaningfully and use it to access financial products on one hand, but also do maybe less tangible returns in terms of returns on privacy, returns on safety, returns on security. And we've been working with, in fact, a Seva cooperative in Western India to help them use the cooperative structure of shared governance, shared values, and pooling of assets such as labor and capital, but also then to pool data and make decisions collectively. And what we found out, because we've also been doing a lot of work on ideas of trust and how women trust technology, and what we've realized is that if women were to use technology as a collective, their levels of trust are very different. If women were to think about governance as a collective method versus an individual one, the safety, security, and reliability of those experiences is much more. So we've been trying to create bottom-up mechanisms of data governance that are anchored in women's social cohesion and social groups, and lean in on time-tested institutions such as cooperatives to enhance that value of data and help women become a more robust part of this digital economy.
Yeah, I mean, and thinking about data and the kind of risks that can be posed, and not just to women, and one of the things that completely bothers me is the way we use gender in a very loose fashion, because really in the inclusive finance sector, we're referring to just the binary biological sex. Correct. We're not referring to gender in its broader perspective. But when you talk about data and you talk about designing surveys, and thanks to Himangni, I've been schooled in gender now. So, I really want to understand what does this mean, because responsible finance is not just, it is for the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And some of those that, align with other genders might respond to surveys very differently. So have you thought about that and what it might mean in terms of sharing data?
No, absolutely. And I think that those considerations are also baked into our surveys. So for instance, these questions on digital trust, we are also taking them to trans communities, and unsurprisingly finding that their concerns around trust when it comes to digital platforms is vastly different from those of women in the binary sense of the word. So we're cognizant of that. We're also cognizant of mechanisms of consent, for instance, right? What mechanisms of using data, what do you use, purpose limitations and questions like that. And that's why we feel that as individuals, you and I are not empowered in the context of the data economy to make these decisions for ourselves. Not because of a competence issue, just because the enormity of what the digital world is and isn't, we have no ability to negotiate. And that's why what we've been advocating for at APTI and been trying to build is these collective mechanisms, because a group of women or a group of trans activists or LGBTQ non-profits are the points of resistance and the points of inclusion and the points of negotiation that we need to build when it comes to things like data use, and not just about data as a tool to access better services and all of that, but also data as a tool to preserve my information, to make sure that it is what I share is for my interest, and when it's not necessary, it's not shared for my interest. So, yeah.
I'm going to come back to you, because I'm going to actually, so the idea of collectives is fascinating. I love it. But it brings to mind the problem of scale. And as an investor, or if you adopt the investor lens, that's the one thing that everybody wants. What are some of the biases that you might think investors need to keep in mind? Particularly in the digital context, what is the, so, remember the last poll that the previous panel ran, where the biggest concern was incentives that businesses have. So, in this case, is there any incentive for business at all to be gender intentional? Women have a higher wage gap, they earn less. Is there a business interest?
I mean, just coming to biases, I think what we have to realize is that when we design for women, that women do have lesser access and a disparate access and unequal access to assets. I think of, just citing an example of how we worked with this bias and worked through it, and coming to the example of collectives. In a MasterCard funded program, as you know, Michael had mentioned about it. We digitally transformed and worked with 9 financial service providers globally, and impacted almost 6 million MSMEs. One of our partners was Annapurna, sitting there. And the challenge that this was just pre-COVID was how do you increase digital collections to us? Now, we do know that, and specifically in India, most of the population, especially as you go rural, only have a shared access to a smartphone. So what we did was really working with the family members, the community, the loan officers, to build that trust of these women to start accepting digital payments. Then looking at the data, we noticed that there were natural digital corridors where there were direct benefit transfers or milk transfers, or even in Bihar, for example, where husbands of family members tend to work in cities, and the women are left with these smartphones, which their children previously were learning on. And we use that data to get, and Annapurna saw nearly 50% increase in digital collections. The average today of digital collections for microfinance organizations is around 5 to 6%. But Annapurna was able to drive nearly 50% of their digital, their portfolio through digital collections. But not to stop there, what we found that these women were, when they started with payments as a use case, but then gradually began using digital payments to make education, paying for their children's education, then accepting payments in their businesses. So all to say, although, and coming back to this whole kind of disparate access to digital technologies, we were able to use the data to be able to still address these kind of unequal access to technologies, to smartphones, and address biases. So that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great, and I feel like we need more examples from investors on what's really working, so that we can elevate it. I'm hoping that RFF will help do that. But I do want to jump back to something that you mentioned earlier, ma'am, and I want to know if that's something that you've seen as a problem to scale, because you did mention employee gender sensitization.
Definitely. So one part, of course, as we look at the responsible lending, is to continuously listen to the voices of customer, what they need, what they require, and which is aptly described by Chetna ma'am over here. So while we are listening to the borrowers, the one part which is very important, and here I am taking a couple of steps ahead. I'm saying that I'm not talking about microfinance, which is a different product altogether. I'm talking about a housing finance or any other financing mode, which basically looks at creating assets. And therefore, not only for assets for the family, but assets for women, who are the main dispensation of the mode of that credit getting into the family's kitty. So the other important aspect is to gain their trust, because they are going to depart with a very, very tangible asset that they have, which is a property ownership paper to a mortgage lender for 8, 10, 12 years. And that trust needs to be built by people whom are familiar with the social and the cultural context of those communities, of those societies or the collectives which we are referring to. And therefore, within the team, you need to have that kind of gender-sensitized workforce. That's what I meant. Secondly, when we are talking about reaching out to the other gender communities, similarly, in your workforce also, you have to increase that kind of diversity. People over here across the room have been used to talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but we tend to kind of sweep it with a broad brush. And therefore, diversity, when we talk about, you have to actually have those kind of policies in place, first and foremost. So it begins with your governance structure and the policy framework that you have, and those policies have to be implemented. And therefore, what you referred to, Shweta, when you are making those hiring decisions, it's always going to be easy to hire men. But whether to include women in the workforce and then focus on their capacity building, their training. In the parallel also keep on sensitizing the male counterpart so that they do not feel excluded. So those kind of steps have to be taken by the institutions, and that's where you have a more sensitized workforce. For example, I'll tell you that after doing a gender action plan and the implementation targets in place, I was very pleasantly surprised and quite happy and contented that my senior management, all of them got together and discussed that if we have to retain women in the workforce, because they tend to have various life cycle challenges, various biological challenges, whether it is motherhood or getting married and getting shifted to newer cities, you not only have to have flexibility in your working hours, but what about the other health parameters? And therefore they came up with a solution that during the monthly menstrual cycle, what if we give them work from home? So they came up with their work from home policy specifically for the menstrual cycle part, and they actually implemented it. This is what I meant when you have a sensitized workforce. Your business head, your operations head, your technology head, your HR head, all can come together and come up with these kind of solutions so that you can have a more gender balanced workforce. Yeah. So, and in parallel, one example which I would like to say, or rather quote or the data point is that amongst the 22,000 families that we have financed so far, barely 19% of them have women who have access to smartphones. Otherwise, they have access to shared resources, as both of you mentioned. And therefore, it becomes very difficult for organization like us or even Mandeshi, even if we have that approach, the gender intentional approach of how do we send messages, how do we train them digitally, how do we train them virtually. So these are the challenges that we face. These are practical challenges. But what we have also increasingly realized that even if we are not talking to the female who is our main borrower most of the time, or in her case also the main borrower or the main customer, if we keep on training the family, they are at least able to use the digital payment to make the loan repayment or do any kind of other transactions. And there we have seen a clear uptake, which started off with barely 10%, which has gone up to about 20% right now. So, which is, I would say, a very encouraging sign.
What would you need? I'm curious, before I just jump to Ma'am Chetna now, but what would you need to increase that number? What is your barrier to scale?
I think the trainings that is required, I mean, she mentioned about the debt counseling, which is a very dedicated, specific focus. It's not only about digital literacy. Here you have to actually handhold them to make them, first of all, have that trust, which she spoke about, Astha spoke about, the trust in the technology and which we also saw over here, because they are not used to it, they do not understand where the money will go or where is it in the transit. So therefore, them to have that trust, you need to handhold them. So initially, I believe many practicing institutions over here have invested in financial literacy trainings. But those trainings now need to have one additional layers. I'm sure people are doing digital literacy, but actually having maybe customer service officers at branches who can do those kind of hand-holding of the customers.
No, that's...
And that is a lot of investment. Therefore, it does require not only the intention part of it, but some serious funding and some serious budget being allocated for that.
And ma'am, I know we spoke about this very briefly, but you had said that a lot of people ask you, why hasn't Mandeshi Bank scaled beyond where it does work? And I know you work in some of the most underprivileged districts in Maharashtra. How did what are some of the challenges that you've faced and how have you got around it? And what is scale to you?
So there are, before coming to the scale, and you talked about the smartphone, I just would like to say that, about how do you increase the percentage? Post-COVID, what we did was that every household, there is whole mindset, like one household, one gas, one household, one this. And we said, like, this is very poor way of thinking. One household, one smartphone, why? Right? So then we said, and we told regulator that you put it into the priority sector lending. That if you give smartphone, it will come under priority sector lending. So the mainstream banking will give loan to buy smartphone. That's how Mandeshi started giving loan to buy smartphone to women. And in our area, we have been able to bring it to 80%. Now I'm responding to this, that how do you bring the scale? Because sometimes you just have to tell regulator that put it into it and every bank will follow, which they should have otherwise also. You don't need such things to follow. But otherwise, apart from that, when I'm talking about now Mandeshi Bank, if you're talking about the scale, in India, it's a very relative term. Like anybody would say, right, Mandeshi Bank is not a scale. And I also do think that we are not outside Maharashtra. But how do I design my whole banking pattern that it is replicated at a national level, right? That is very, very important, I think. And let me give you an example of one product which we designed and how it took over to change the policy and it became a national product. That is, and of course, Seva was there with Mandeshi together. So we were seeing in our bank that every woman would do a term deposit and every month she would take out the interest from there. Correct. And we would see so many women doing it. Yes. And we just ask, I know we talk about the data and observe the behavior and all. So we ask, what is happening? Why every month you take out the interest and for what you are using? So these women said that we need medicine, we need this. And we realized that unknowingly, but these women were actually designing their own pension product, right? By investment. So then we thought, why don't we design a pension product? And we went to the mutual fund, national mutual fund that we want to design, and Ila Ben was there at that time. So we said, of course, we are alone, but we together can do it. So Mandeshi, Seva, and there was one organization in southern India. We came together, created a fund, and then designed a pension product for women. It was first time inaugurated by Finance Minister of India in 2009. And it was no mainstream banking was there. And these women were wage laborers, street vendors, and they came out with this pension product. And I'm so proud to share with you that finally this pension product became the National Pension Scheme of India, and today it is Atal Pension Yojana, where all over India these women are investing in that and getting the pension. And I would also like to add that not just gender intentionality, but it is a client intentionality. What we did in this pension product also, we said that there should be a component for sex workers, because they want pension at a very different age. You cannot generalize, right? And you will be surprised that, of course, that fund also, because there was enough money, pool of fund, and we designed for the sex workers also who would get pension at the age of 40 or 35, whatever they decide. And we could do that. So what I'm trying to say is that how do you look at the scale? One is that you yourself have say 10 million, 15 million, or you see that the national policies, banking policies are made through your product. Of course, you have to do a lot of lobbying for that. And you have to come together, do lobbying, never get tired. And I would just like to also end with it that it's not, in morning I was listening about all this ecosystem of digital financial thing. That whole ecosystem is so fragile. Running a bank, having digital banking, handling switch vendors, handling these national payment service, handling account aggregator, handling regulator, everywhere, tirelessly, you have to fight, you have to fight, and you have to fight. But finally, I would just say that if you do it, then something like this national pension scheme can come. If you do it, then today you see like billions of transactions happening on digital platform, right? There are a lot of loopholes. So I do think that scale comes. It is just that I will never get old. No, no, no. Scale comes and our new generation is there who will take it forward. But you just have to prepare yourself
Relentlessly work towards it.
and work towards it. And I would just say that at the end that I mean, a lot of indexes, and you see there is so much of frustration, right, about what is the ratio, women, where are women, and all that. But when you see women on the ground, and you see the wealth creation, what they do with your intervention, it just tells you that you will have to reach each and every person on the globe.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, on that note, I want to, do we have time for audience questions? I can't see.
And
my
Jashi, if
screen.
I may come up with a quick
Yeah,
intervention.
please do.
So, I mean, just to follow up that, which is hard to do, but also to say that what Chetna ma'am said is that there's a process of co-design, and that's also what we're trying to do at APTI, is that, you know, as we think of new products and new technologies, and, you know, when we ask questions of ourselves as to why don't women trust technologies, etc., I think that what we've heard from everybody is that women need to be part of this conversation. So we've been doing a lot of work around thinking of how do we co-design solutions. And it doesn't need to be, like you said, it doesn't need to be a solution that fits everyone. It just needs to be something that you're able to do and apply to different communities and be able to extrapolate it and make those strains of sort of like bottom-up interventions and testing and figuring things out meet with the top-down policy interventions. And I think that if that's something that we can figure out, then this overarching question of like, how do we build for gender intentionality? We don't actually have to. We just have to make sure that there are avenues for women to build for themselves. Yeah. And that's what we should be looking to create.
Yeah. I love it. Do we have time for questions? 10 minutes, says Karthik. Are there burning questions that, Amol?
When we are talking about this responsible digital finance ecosystem, grievance redress and recourse is a very, very critical, important component. So when you took a gender intentional approach, how does that recourse and grievance redress change for women, and how does that should that look differently as it looks for other gender? Thank you.
So when you design a redressal approach or complaint mechanisms, how do you think about How do you think about it differently for women versus men? Is there a need to do that?
So, so I think it is, right? Because we're looking at like what we socio-patriarchal issues that we have to deal with in the context of addressing women's needs. So I think that one of the men can go to the ration shop or the bank physically and ask the question, why has my money not come, etc. Whereas for women, what we found is WhatsApp groups and just more offline or more online and potentially anonymous mechanisms are helpful, IVRs as a way to do this. So we've been doing the research on the ground and seeing that when it comes to maternal benefits, women find it quite easy to reach out to their frontline worker on WhatsApp, even before they tell their husbands and things like that. And so there is obviously a difference in the way that you design grievance. And I think, again, like if one was to go and ask the women, where is your level of comfort? What kind of ways work for you when it comes to grievance? What makes sense for you? I think we'd come up with similar answers.
You know what? I would just address this answer in that way. One thing is, you see your client, no?
Exactly.
And your men client and your women client are so different. Men have collateral, women don't have collateral. Yes. So, I mean, I think there are so many. Listen to your client. It will be very different response. And I have learned one thing by running Women's Bank. That is when you talk, when you women come forward, no? One thing in the music in your ear works is that they say, don't give poor solutions to poor people.
Exactly.
They are smart. And I would just end with this, that when you have a statistics where not even 5% of the population on the globe, women are owning the property, which clearly indicates that we need something very differently. And at the same time, I would say that with all this digital transaction and all, sometimes you may not give you are giving them property, right? Ownership of property. But sometimes their digital transactions itself would de-risk the lender, that she has so many buying and selling happening. I don't need collateral. Seeing her accounts, I will pay, I will give a loan. So there are a lot of ways where you can see, observe, deal with differently. But at the same time, at last, I would just say that in spite of all that, there has to be a client intentionality continuously, and that is equally important. And I do think that banking sector has to be like reminded every time that supply side should think of demand side instead of pushing their products.
So again, to supplement what both of them said, customer centricity is important. The women's voices will obviously be different. I'll just give a quick example. We, in housing finance, home loan construction is one product, the other is a loan against property. Where loan against property, they mortgage their homes to either invest in their businesses and at times also for consumption. So we do have loan against property, and here we had a lady who had already taken loan against property to do quilts and make those businesses, and she was employing about 4 or 5 women across in her vicinity, in her neighborhood. And then she came back to us for a larger amount. Now usually it is termed as a top-up. All of us have heard about top-ups. Most of us have policies that top-ups will happen after a certain period of time. But here she was back asking for a top-up within just 6 to 8 months. So you have to listen to that customer and understand that why is she asking for it? Is it really going to help her business? Is it really going to upscale? And there we realized that she was actually asking for a top-up to build an extra room where she could create a sort of a work shed or a workspace to hire more women and therefore enhance or increase her business. So then you have to change your policy accordingly. So that's how the redressal will happen, and I hope collectively we have answered your question.
Shweta, any last thoughts?
No, I mean, just I completely agree to that whole listening to the customer. I mean, one of our own experiences is we were working with Banco Pichincha in Ecuador, and they had put out a credit card product, and they found that women were just getting rejected. And you would normally think that okay, women don't have access to credit, but what they had a variable in their algorithm where women were people were being dinged for many outstanding credits. And then they looked at the data and they found that actually these women were borrowing for their family members, right? I mean, women tend to be the front face for their children. They want to buy for education and all that. So then they changed that variable and they said, okay, we are going to take a risk on these women. We are going to give them more debt because they can pay that debt, although they are faced for this credit. And so they were able to reach more women than the men within the credit. So that listening to that customer and understanding their needs to then change that product is just so important. I think even Gerard mentioned in CGAP, right, that customer centricity is so important. That's true.
I actually want to ask the audience, what are the top 3 things you think this community needs to work on over the next year or 2 years?
I think to kind of create any systemic change or have product innovation, first step is to get the data. And I feel like there's a whole absence of gender disaggregated data at multiple levels, and some that Shweta highlighted that they try to get it from their portfolio companies. But in terms of having that kind of data on a regular standardized basis, not one-off Findex which happens in 3 years, but having them from banks, from credit institutions, from regulators, RBI, IRD, all of them putting that out, just starts kind of throwing light on how much access is there, how much usage is happening. And that becomes the starting point to kind of start thinking about innovating new products, also to kind of see their behavior. And I think one comment I had, when I was listening to the entire panel today, that yes, today's entire conversation were around low-income household women, financial inclusion. But even if we zoom out, and we've done some research in that space, even when it comes to better income categories, there is a lot of hesitation from the women to kind of use financial products. And it's not voluntary exclusion that I don't think I need the product, so I'll stay out of it. It's a lot of hesitation, it's a lot of agency issue, lack of collateral, of course. It's also, even in the digital finance space, the way women look at a fintech app is very different from the way man looks at it. Unfortunately, a lot of financial products are created with the mindset of how a man would look at it. So I think that those things, I think Chetna ma'am spoke about train the man also, train the staff, that comes at every level of product building. So yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Thank you, Monami. Rupal.
My name is Rupal, and just 3 things on the last question that you asked, Jayashree. I think one is to also look at the role of culture, technology, and gender. Particularly in Rajasthan, where I've worked before, there is a very strong association between women's access to technology and then women belonging to dysfunctional families. So there is this sense that access to technology will create some sort of dysfunction in the family, and hence it's highly discouraged, which also in a way impacts women's labor force participation, because by participating in the workforce, you're more likely to have access to technology. So one is to really look at how does culture shape women's access to technology and thereby digital inclusion. The second one is also from a labor point of view, looking at insurance and what are specific gender risks, risks that women face in particular, especially if we look at manufacturing processes. Some of the most hazardous work that happens in manufacturing are actually done by women, and these are very hidden. It's a very hidden part of the workforce. So how does insurance, in both its design and in terms of access, to payouts, how does insurance become more sensitive to gender? And lastly, having worked as a financial service provider, I can tell you that for a decade we've tried really hard to bring women in leadership roles in financial institutions, but that has been a big struggle. We find, it's been a struggle to have women as, frontline workers itself. But beyond that also, it's very hard to see a lot of these women progress into more leadership roles where they can affect internal policies, hiring decisions, promoting other women, and so on. So it's also a question to the wider group that how do we encourage that in the financial services space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rupal. So I come from the insurance sector, and I would like to echo her second point, I think, and also build upon what was just said. I don't think the financial services providers fully understand the needs of women. There's a very, very long way to go to actually understand what happens on ground and how does it reflect in the products that are being built. So there's a massive need for education, but the other way around, not just educating women about existing products, and I do want to make a comment on that, but more to educate the industry on what's required. It might be a bit of a stretch to say, but I think it's very important to also have panels where we see and hear women speak about their needs and perhaps what has worked in the past, and educate ourselves as the industry providers as to, hey, how can we maybe meet some of these demands, if not all of them. But the other thing I'd also like to be curious about and maybe suggest as something to work over the next year is, if somebody says that they don't understand Google Pay and a simple mistake in an account number or a name is so difficult and makes their lives and creates so many grievances for them, how hard is it to create a video explaining Google Pay? And bringing in this aspect of, look, it's not so obvious and so immediately or easily understandable for everyone when you build a new financial product or a technology. So how about keeping that intentionality or just thinking about designing everything but then explaining it also for everyone who has never seen something like this before and who's not had access. So when we're talking about education and raising awareness, being very mindful of the fact that awareness does not necessarily have to be about the fancy things and about fancy products that the financial industry comes up with. It can also be about simple mechanisms that are already useful and are being used by their counterparts, but might not be just as accessible or just as easily trustable for some of these women. Thanks.
Joanna.
Thanks for giving me, and I'll be very, very quick. But you said three things, and I think that a lot of people have already mentioned how important it is to really understand women's needs, preferences, and capabilities, which are different, whether that speaks to collateral or digital literacy, whatever it might be. So really understanding that, and I think we pay too much lip service to that. Second, really understanding how gender norms impact not just women's behavior, but the behavior of everybody, policymakers, bank tellers, agents, everybody. So I think understanding gender norms. So it does speak to the data aspect, which has come up, but also a lot of qualitative understanding of the gender norms and how those might change, where there is some potential for change. And then third thing, I think we do need to work with men as well. And because it's about sensitizing, that's been mentioned by the fabulous panel. But also, it's not just a matter of trying to change women's behavior. It's changing all the players in the ecosystem, because gender norms impact what everybody how everybody's behaving, and we need to look at incentives to change that behavior. So.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. And I did see a lot of hands, so I don't want to lose your ideas. So please email us, because we will take it very seriously. This was such a fabulous panel. I can't thank you enough for your time and your insights and these great examples. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And see you at dinner.